Awesome. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, David. Hopefully, you're still with me. This is a really fun one today. We're going to be talking about analyzing malware, in particular Android malware, and how David, one of the best in the business, goes through the process of kind of grabbing a sample, uh, looking at kind of what that sample does, using Hunchly throughout, and then kind of tying together additional data using OSINT and other tactics. This is going to be a lot of fun. It's definitely a different topic than we've covered before. Once again, we usually run about an hour. It can be longer or shorter depending on how many questions we field. Please use the question and answers box to send any questions in. I'll be interrupting David, I'm sure, about 100 times throughout this thing. So if you have questions you want him to field, definitely let me know. And it will be recorded. So when this is all over with, we'll put this up on our YouTube channel. So if you do run into audio or video issues, don't fret. It will be up on YouTube. You'll be able to watch it at your leisure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to show us how he took just a report from Meta on a particular kind of campaign, and how he kind of dug a little bit deeper behind the report to see if there were other indicators. And as you will see, he finds some pretty interesting stuff. He's going to teach us about MobSF, which is this incredible framework to analyze malware, or mobile malware, in particular Android. And it's free, which I can't believe. I just started using it a couple of days again after David showed me kind of how to get it running. So this is going to be really cool. I'm going to stand back now. And again, if you have any questions around that you want answered, fire them into that Q&A box, and I will do my best to jump in. So with that, David, you can take it away.
Hey, thanks, man. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, so when Justin and I first started talking about coming on to do this, I was trying to think about presenting something that I hadn't seen in the Hunchly webinar yet. And I'm pretty sure this hasn't been covered yet. So what we're going to be discussing today is using Hunchly in congruence with MobSF, which is the mobile security framework, to be able to take indicators, make notes on reporting, and then relate that to open source intelligence research. So this report from Meta came out in the middle of November, and effectively all they did was outline some campaigns, some region attribution, and then they gave you some indicators. So companies like Meta have to keep a lot of stuff under the belt, but I don't. So the first thing that I generally do with these types of reports is I'll take all of these indicators, editing descriptions or notes, and just do a bulk add. So if we go back into our case right here, we've created a case, we just called it Meta APK. And I just go in here and I just bulk add all of the indicators. So we can see here I have quite a few. There aren't this many on the original report, but I'll just go through, add any particular names of interest, domains of interest, IOCs, and then I will take all of the samples and I will put them into MobSF. So as Justin was saying, MobSF is a security framework. It's completely free, which is great. So if you do use it and you like it, please donate to the developer so we can keep it free. It's one of the best platforms out there for doing Android malware analysis in the free space. So once I get all the samples, you can get them a lot of different places. There's Kudios, APK, Lab, stuff like that. But you get all the samples and you process them, and it's locally hosted. So the problem I always run into, and I don't know about anyone else, but anytime I'm doing analysis, I'm constantly losing track of what I was looking at, particularly when I'm looking at a defined campaign or I'm trying to determine attribution. Sometimes you can go out there, you can use Maltego. Maltego is great for indicators. It's not really good for note-taking if you're keeping track of things. It's good for representation once you're doing a report. But usually what ends up happening is I end up with a really gigantic document like this, which is horrible. And then I'm going around doing a Control F, trying to find where that C2 was related to, if the signing certificate was similar, and then I end up creating another tab and saying these might be similar, and then going back and reviewing them. It's a horrible process. There are a lot of systems you can use to try to do those, but they're really expensive, and they're like at an enterprise price point. So for the most part, if you're just doing analysis for fun, like I do, and not getting paid for it, this is what you end up with. So you can have a Word document, whatever, but at the end of the day, it sucks. Like there's no way to correlate things. There's no way to relate this to open source intelligence. So if I find something related to a particular application name or something that has attribution related to a defined actor, I end up with them in separate locations. So what I like to do with Hunchly is once I have all of my samples in here, most of the ones in here are from this related campaign, but I will go in and I'll start looking for primary indicators I'm interested in for a pivot context. So a lot of those have to do with the signer of the application, domains, defined strings. Sometimes there's a lot of typos that particular developers like to make a lot. If they're a non-English speaker, a lot of times it's very easy to map out where they may or may not be from based on how they translate things. And sometimes you can even determine what they translated, and you can add those as either a link selector, a text selector, or just make a note within the analysis. So if I go to an example one like this one right here, this is a Middle Eastern impersonation of WhatsApp called WhatsApp Plus.
So David,
it's been in use. Yeah.
Sorry, before you move on that far, so when
Sure.
you need to load samples into MobSF, how do you do it? Like you just like upload them manually, or how do you typically do that?
Sure. So if you do it in the API, so it also has an API, so you can do bulk loads.
Ah.
So you can just give it a directory and it'll do it that way. Or you can just upload it here and
Nice.
it'll just upload all of them. There is also the ability that they've added in recent revisions where if it's something that's in the Play Store, you can actually just put the package name in here and it'll grab it from a Play Store or a third party correlated with the Play Store and then automatically allow you to analyze it. It
Awesome.
does also have the ability to do dynamic analysis. So you can integrate it with Genymotion, Frida, a bunch of different things. And you can do screen monitoring, all that stuff that you can do with the normal sandbox. And you would also be able to integrate that with Hunchly too. So once you have the output of, say, a trace for an execution in Frida, you'd be able to link those selectors with class files or whatever. Basically, anywhere there's a string, you can correlate it. That's the only real drawback that I found with MobSF and with a lot of tools is oftentimes I want to search for something that either isn't indexed, so I'd have to customize the code to get it there, and then I'm redoing it every time they have a new Git commit, or it's just not available at all. So like this, you can pretty much only search by MD5. You can do some additional stuff with the API, but things like all of the strings for a given sample generally aren't indexed because that would be really labor intensive from a processing perspective. And you get a lot of false positives too. So sometimes when you're indexing strings, it depends on how you are coming at the strings.
Sure.
And then the developer would have to know what you're doing. And so the really nice thing from this, and the main thing I use MobSF for, other than just like email addresses and IPs and stuff like that, is there's a built-in code viewer. So you don't have to use JADX or JDGUI. There's a lot of different tools to do it outside of the MobSF context. But again, the problem you run into, and that's what I started doing here, is I was using JADX and I was going through and I was getting indicators of interest. Okay, I see in this particular sample that it was hosted on this IP, it's possibly correlated with this group, and then here are some interesting strings of interest from the developer with respect to what this service is. But then I don't have any way to look it up outside of my amazing gedit file here, which also for sharing, if anyone's ever tried to do campaign analysis with multiple people, a text document generally is not the best way to do it. You run into a weird telephone game with like who has the most recent version of whatever the export is, whether it's from, crits or MISP or whatever. Where with this, and I actually did this in preparation for this, I had my entire case that I'd done outside of the MobSF context on another VM, and all I did was just exported the case file, and then I imported it onto this VM where I had MobSF installed and I already had all the samples.
Your Hunchly.
So automatically from the research I've done just going around on the internet doing OSINT things, I automatically had selector hits. As you can see right now, I have 21 hits, and that's because I have all the samples correlated. But I also have the package names, APK names, and stuff like that. And then if I go into the individual report, in addition to just looking at, if we just pull up this WhatsApp one here, I can go in and I can start highlighting class files, deobfuscated string names, encryption keys, all that stuff. Stuff that even in some of the more enterprise platforms, you can't do. Even some really expensive tools that a lot of people pay for that may or may not start with a V, don't index a lot of these things that you're interested in, right? So VirusTotal is a really widely used tool, but unless you have a paid subscription, you can't see strings. You have limited ability to search for said strings. This was taking a little while to load because it's a pretty large sample. But if we scroll down here, once this loads, let me reload this. You can go in and actually look at the Smalley and the standard output of the class files, and then just start highlighting away. And then from there, you can start making correlations. MobSF is very overburdened right now, so I'll go back into Hunchly and get to where where I was at. So one thing that's really beneficial from Hunchly is while I have all of this data in here, yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I've done about 147 different captures. But if I go in here and I go into data, and I know there was an email address associated with some code, but I can't remember what the email address was or where it came from or what samples it was related to. I just know it was like a Gmail account or something. I can come in here and I can go into accounts, and then I can actually find the email address, this one right here, which is associated with these Google searches I did before, but it's also associated with these samples I see in MobSF, and then some other samples that I see in some more open source tools. And then I can make that a selector if I didn't know about it before or if I forgot to select it. And this actually happened when I was importing this. Is I did this a while ago, and I actually couldn't remember the email address. So what I ended up doing is what I just outlined right here. I said, well, okay, I know it's in there somewhere because I captured it. Let me find it, and it's this one right here. And the really cool thing that you'll see is I have it in every format. I don't just have the standard string. So if I'm looking it up in the context of, say, a function decompilation, I can see all the different ways it presents and then where it occurred. So with this one, why this is also really useful from an Android analysis perspective is one of the big shortcomings that people run into when they start doing Android analysis is they assume if a Gmail address or any email address for that matter is extracted from a sample, that's going to be like the developer's malware address. And oh, they screwed up, they left it in there. And then they might waste a whole day or two looking into it. This one, for example, this Ron and John email address right here, we can see that it's associated with multiple samples. But I know from looking at it that the actual sample itself is related to a GitHub project that the group name with help decided to use, and they associated it. So if we go down, we can see this is the actual C2. They use the built-in debug certificate, and his actual email address, if we look for Varun here, I think it's Varun. Yeah, there he is. We can see that it's a string resource. And then if we open up the string resource, we'll actually see the GitHub repository that it's associated with. And I just saved myself like a day. And awesome. I even, when I started looking at this one, noticed that, well, that's interesting. It's a Gmail address. All the other ones are Gmail addresses. And I could make a really false assumption here. And I could create a dossier on some poor individual that's just an open source developer that happened to make an Android library. And then if I click into the actual string resource, it would take me out to his GitHub repo, which is really beneficial. And very similar, people have never looked at Android. They don't know whether or not Android.com shows up as an example. And you can quickly just go in and strip all of those out. And this is what I use a lot because this will pull all the email addresses out from the signing certificates. And it'll pull out the interesting Telegram link. So if I go in here, I can go into the history and I can pull out the Telegram links associated with the amazing What's Plus. I think that's what it's called, if I remember correctly. There it is.
That's the fake app, right?
Yeah, so this is the fake app. It's right here. And I just went there. They're still serving it up, which is great. So we got forwarded. Here's their version of WhatsApp. And this actual link right here is one of the link selectors that I had from the malware that I analyzed like 2 or 3 months ago. So from a posterity perspective, I hadn't looked at this since November or early December. So I didn't remember any of this. And I just opened up my Hunchly case and I looked for the t.me's because I couldn't remember what the Telegram handle was. And then I looked it up a couple days ago, and oh, look, they have a new version of the app. And I didn't have to reanalyze all the samples. Because that's what used to happen all the time, is I'd move a VM. I think we've all done this. We accidentally delete the wrong VM, or we thought we snapshotted it when we had the analysis in there, and then we revert, and oh, it's all gone because I didn't offload it. So that actually has happened with this one too, but I happen to have my Hunchly case, and then I just imported it into this one. So that's the main thing that I use this for. And then what's really interesting is when I'm looking at this, I can associate this with a MobSF. So oftentimes what a lot of my workflow will look like is it'll be a MobSF post here, and then a query of some sort, or me going directly to the URL defined in the sample. And then I can see the flow once I get to, say, the URL scan. And so URL scan is another really useful thing in the context of Hunchly, because URL scan, another great free product for the time being. Please support them. I think they have pretty good backers now, so I think this should be okay. But it has the DOM, the full text, and stuff like that. So even if you capture it in Hunchly, very often you can take function names that may or may not have appeared in an app that's no longer up, and they moved it to another one, and you had a string selector from 2 months ago that now triggers on the associated string that you put in that you forgot about. And so with this one, when I actually was looking at the screenshots for the correlated URL scan, that's how I ended up here, because they had a new redirect from a URL scan that I'd done 2 months ago.
Ah, very cool. Excellent. Okay, well, I apologize for derailing you from showing us MobSF again. Hopefully it's all done, loaded.
Yeah,
there we go.
There it is.
Taking it,
Yeah,
I mean, in demos.
it's kind of a big one. Yeah, yeah. So it's a 50 meg sample. So this is one of the newer ones. So they're using this old cert, and then if we scroll down, we have all of these different things that we can look through individually. Or if anyone's ever looked at Android analysis, you can actually just view the source, and it looks very similar to JADX or any of the other tools. It effectively just has a class breakdown. Again, this one has like 98 activities, so the Java decompiling might take a little while, and the indexing of it. But with this, very similar to like with a Hunchly case, you can search the strings. So if someone on Twitter, because this happens a lot with the Android analysis community, someone, and I'm guilty of this a lot too, someone will share a sample and say, here's the C2, and then move on. And that's all you got. And you're trying to retrace how they got there. I can't find the C2 or whatever. With this, now, so you don't end up with this mess, here's all of my source code right here. And I can actually just go into the code, and now you're able to use Hunchly to actually highlight on Java code in the context of the APK. So in addition to linking to the sample, which this one's huge, it's 50 meg. So if you're looking at a 50 meg sample, very often it could be like, where was the C2 defined again? I forgot to write a YAR rule for it. I didn't make a note for it. If you have a selector for a defined string or for the C2, that'll be highlighted in the class, because all of these are captured individually within the context of the sample. So right now, all I'm doing is viewing it. MobSF actually does all of this on the back end before the report is completed. So the reason it was able to come up so quickly is because of the fact it already did all the work, and I'm able to do a string selector. So right now I just have the hash, because this one, it actually ended up not being malicious. This is just someone impersonating WhatsApp, which is great. The smaller one that Meta pointed out was around 4 meg, and they were impersonating this impersonation app, which happens a lot with Middle Eastern malware development. Oh. People are used to using something like Gold Telegram or Gold WhatsApp. Gold's a very popular prefix for the name, and then they'll just put something in there that may or may not. It works really well. I'll have an actual chat application, but then on the back end, they're stealing all of your contact lists, your GPS location, and then having decrypted samples of all your WhatsApp messages shared. Ooh. So This one is, I think, the biggest one. If I had to pick between all of them, I can do the email address on the certificates with like a grep. It's not as pretty, but this is the thing that's really beneficial and that you still can't do with a lot of platforms because classes are a lot of string data. And so what you run into is they may index like the name of the package. So you'll see something that says package name or whatever. All these samples have the same package name, but they don't actually have the content of the package decompiled.
Okay.
And so that's why this is really useful, is because if you have a defined C2, so this one as an example, they have a very similar C2 in about 4 or 5 of the samples. I think it's Das Vidania is string, if I'm remembering correctly. And they're all defined in the same place. So one of the methods for finding similar developers is where they define a certain C2, because sometimes there's a shared C2 and they might define it somewhere, they stole an application. So a lot of these are very cheap or stolen applications. There's SpyNote, there's SpyMax, and all of those. But if the developer is defining it in the same class, it'd be really easy to see. Then you could look for the string and you could say, oh, these 5 samples all have this C2 defined, maybe using the same encryption key in the same class file, no matter what they're impersonating. Then you can get somewhere where you can get now, where if you see a sample, you automatically know, oh, that's Cerberus, because they always define the class file the exact same way, no matter what the C2 is or who's making it, because it's the builder.
Gotcha. So this is
So
kind
this
of
is
the
really good
equivalent.
for.
Sorry, this is kind of the equivalent of when we're doing like OSINT work and we have, multiple domains that all share the same Google Analytics code. You're doing the same
Yep.
thing using IP addresses and function names and other things in the actual Android app itself, right? To be able to kind of tie together, like this looks like it could be connected, or at least they're using the same command and control infrastructure, the same IP addresses or host names.
Yep. Yeah. And then you can take it and relate it to previous stuff. So one of the things I was doing last night when I was building out my case is that email address I referenced earlier, the Gmail address, the Satay. I found them impersonating a COVID app from like 2020 when everything was in the heat of it. And the way I was able to do that was just with the string selector. So I took the Gmail address and did what everyone does, like their initial step for OSINT is like, let's just put it in the search engine. And so I came up with this delightful application that came out in the mid 2020, and it's signed by the same developer, and it has the same string match, and the C2 is being called in the same way that the report from Meta that came out a year and a half after the fact is doing. So we're
Interesting.
able to make some correlation with something like a simple string match. So we see our boy here again,
So,
or girl.
and right there, you're looking at like it for those people that might be here who have looked at SSL certificates in OSINT. What is it that you're showing right there? It's a code signing certificate, but what is that? If we were to relate that to an SSL certificate, are the tricks kind of relatively the same?
They're pretty much the same. Yeah, the RFCs define the syntax very similarly. So you'll have the country. So this country code doesn't actually exist anymore, which is great because they cut it back in 2017.
Okay.
You'll have the state, the location, the organizational name. Generally, the organizational name in like a signing, or sorry, an SSL certificate would be the organization. So it'd be the certificate authority, or if it's a self-signed cert, it'd be the business. But it's very similar tree structure. So you have the O, the OU, the common name, and then E is for the email address.
Gotcha.
So a lot of times, really cheap malware authors won't actually even have a signed certificate. What you'll very often see is they'll have the default certificate. It'll either be the debug cert or just the generic Android one that comes with Android Studio. But a lot of times, people, if they want to persist something and have something that looks more legitimate, very similar to the good old days when we told everyone if there's a lock, then you're safe. I think we've shifted that hopefully a little bit, but for a while no one would ever have a malicious SSL or TLS certificate.
Right.
And it's still very similar in Android, unfortunately, Google, if anyone from Google is on the call, I apologize, but Google still does a very not great job about keeping stuff out of the Play Store. There's a lot of people that track how many Joker malware samples are in the Play Store on a weekly basis. And the main way that people get around that is they have an actual signing certificate, because a lot of the back-end searches and scanning are just static scans. So one of the things they check for, and VirusTotal does the same if you see a signing certificate, whether it's for Android or for a PE32 or a Mac OS lib, it'll say, is it signed and is it legitimate? And the legitimacy check for SSLs is a little more difficult to impersonate because of how the certificate transparency logs work. And that's done a lot of fun research in that as well. But that you have to have an actual trusted CA.
Right.
These are, is it signed? And that's about it. The only thing they do add when it goes to the Play Store is what they call Google frosting, which is a great name. But if it has Google Play frosting, it's supposed to be, this is more legitimate and we verified this application matches what they initially submitted. But yes, all that to say, it's very similar from a pivot perspective. You have email addresses, organization names, serial numbers, and then the hash associated with the certificate are all things you can pivot off of. Most sandboxes will be able to pivot off the serial number or these defined hashes. Some of them don't allow you to search off the email address. VirusTotal and APK Lab and all of those allow you to. So the cool thing about searching off the email address, very similar to doing SSL pivoting, is if you are doing an SSL pivot and you search off the common name or the subject hash versus just the hash or the serial number of the cert you know about, you can find either certs they've submitted to be new ones and find new infrastructure, or you can have a historical view of the certificates they've had in the past and what infrastructure associated with that. It's very similar. It's a very underutilized thing in Android analysis. A lot of times what you'll see is something very similar to the report we looked at in the beginning, is here are some hashes, here's who they were impersonating, everyone freak out, people are gonna steal everything, don't turn your phone on. And so a lot of people are super numb to it. And the main reason I started using Hunchly for this reason is because that was happening so much that it was very frustrating, right? Because when you're doing analysis, it's very similar when the FBI comes out and they say, haha, we found the threat actor, here's who they are, who their aliases are. Well, that's great. But if you're really into OSINT, you want to know actually how they arrived at that information. So what a lot of us will do is we'll try to figure out where that came from, or see if that aligns with information that we'd already been collecting. For some reason, PE32 and Mac OS and all of them get really detailed reports. It's just very rare that people do detailed reports on APK analysis. And the MobSF, if you look at any of them, so if you look at Sybil or any of the people that do regular Android analysis, you'll almost always see this screen. So if you've ever wondered, no one says, hey, this is MobSF for some reason. But anytime you see something that has the icon here and then this definition with this color scheme, that's MobSF.
Gotcha.
So like the last 3 reports I've looked at in the past week all have MobSF screenshots. And the reason they do is because it doesn't really have a competitor. If you're looking at more advanced malware, you might have to do some freedom in the middle stuff. But one thing that's really interesting from a network analysis pivoting perspective, you can also do dynamic analysis and it will do PCAPs. So if you get the PCAPs, you can also make those string selectors as well. And you can start looking for those. I didn't do that for these because this group was pretty much torn asunder, right? Most of their stuff was taken off of Facebook already. The What's Plus is still up for some reason. Don't know why, but if anyone wants to look at some fun stuff, they do have a great Telegram with a lot of followers. But you could pretty much use this. This doesn't have to be just applicable to MobSF. It could be applicable to anything. I mean, you could use, and I'm pretty sure this has been covered, but you could use this with Spiderfoot, like a Hunchly Spiderfoot integration. You could use it with Assembly Line, which is also a really great tool put out by Canada, good old Canada.
All of Canada put that
pretty much. Yeah, all of Canada. It's a joint effort. But pretty much anything, the takeaway here is anything that you host locally, you can use with search selectors, because most open source tools that are analysis driven either don't have a very good UI. So what you're faced with is you might have the text and you might throw it into Elasticsearch. If you wanted to do a more complicated way of this, and I was going to do this for the demo, but I ran out of time, is this has an Elasticsearch component, and you can also put Hunchly into an Elasticsearch index, and you could just do cross-index searches between the two to highlight them if you didn't want to use necessarily the UI. And then you'd automatically have, oh, well, this person used this code typo. Because a big thing that a lot of people do is there's this thing in Android where you have to tell it, very similarly to other languages, you have to tell it what to log and how you want to log it. One, you get to see a lot of fun expletives that you have to look on Google Translate if you do a lot of Middle Eastern stuff like me, and I have no idea what they mean. But you'll also see a lot of typos, and you'll also see a lot of declarations that may or may not give you the name of a defined malware family, like what they call it, not what the vendors call it. And then you can make that a string identifier. And if you wanted to, allegedly, there are places that they sell these things. And oftentimes what a lot of vendors mess up on is the people making it don't care what you call it. So generally they're going to have a different name for their sample, especially when it comes to Android malware is very popular in certain Russian forums. And a lot of times if you're looking for it with an English defined string, you're not going to find it. You have to know what they call it in code. So yeah, it's really useful tool as like a baseline and not having to keep notes. And so then when you do get to the point of, I want to define who this actor is, or I want to find additional infrastructure, then you have all of the strings from the code as the overlay that you can line up later. Gotcha. And MobSF also does allow you to do reporting. So if you are escalating this to an authority, you can escalate this PDF report, you can do a case export, and then you can just put them together. So there's no question of, well, how did you get this string declaration? You could just make a note in your Hunchly case that says, here's the hash where this string or this declaration came from, and then also hand them the report from MobSF when you're giving them your package.
And so if, like, let's say I'm, and which I am, compared to you, definitely new to this kind of whole thing, and I've just loaded up this sample we're looking at right now, this Corona Live sample. I mean, what would you tell me to look at first on this page? Like, what is really, like, as someone who's new to this but has a general understanding of how to investigate stuff online, I mean, what are some of the things on this kind of summary screen that you kind of hone in on right away?
Sure. So this one's kind of boring, but the main things you want to look at when you're first starting, he's actually done, I think it's 4 people that work on this. They've done a really good job, in my opinion. Obviously, I'm super novice when it comes to Android too. This is just like a side hobby. They've done a really good job of prioritizing what you should care about from left to right. Obviously, it's going to be dependent on what you're looking at. Okay. But the names from an Android perspective are pretty straightforward. It's a really fun thing to get into. So activities is exactly what you think it is. What does it do? Okay. Service declarations are exactly what you think they do. So if we go in and we click into the services, this one is a bad example, right? Because obviously it's super encoded because of the type of sample that I'm looking at. But oftentimes this will be another really good use case for a text filter. Because if you're looking at something that's part of a builder, or you're looking at something where people just make the same thing over and over, oftentimes, especially if it's a novice developer, they'll just have the name. So it'll be whatever the package name is, .remote stealer, or SMS stealer, okay, or upload service, or something like that. Yep. This one's a horrible example, right? Because this is unique. And a lot of times these are really great because, so like here is the decoded string. So we know right away that this is the C2. So here's the C2 right here. So I know that everyone gives strings a bad rap, right? That's always the IDA joke, is open subview strings. I did it, I reversed it. But unfortunately, Android is still really far behind with respect to packers and DEX class loading and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times novice developers will still just have stuff in strings. They'll either encrypt it in a really easy way to take away. One I was looking at very recently that I think we got taken down, but they were using GitHub for like 4 months, and they were using the same encryption key in all of the samples, and all they were doing was base 64 encoding a string and then using the same encryption key over and over and over again. And I mean, it worked great. I mean, it took direct reaching out to GitHub security to get it taken down.
Right.
So props to them. But I mean, that's how low the bar is still for Android. It's not like right now with PE32 or PE64 binaries where if you're not using a packer doing some sort of second and third stage obfuscation, most tools are going to pick it up. Android, for some reason, is just still not moving very quickly. And that's why I actually recommend people doing Android analysis first. One, the samples are very readily available. Every sample that was in here was in Kudios, which is completely free. You just sign up and you can download samples, or they're in APK Lab, which is provided by Avast, which is also free. And it's just really good way to figure out how the basics of code analysis work. What's also very interesting if you're looking, let's say, into a non-defined malicious actor, quote unquote, but someone that may or may not be doing something suspicious. This will automatically look at the trackers. So if they're saying something like, let's say allegedly, if you were to put TikTok in here, this table would be a lot more full because it automatically pulls known tracker lists out, either by defined IPs or URLs or DNS names. It'll give you the categorization of what it's tracking and then the reference point for where it came from. But to go back, if we are going to the right, the next one is going to be the services. Again, to see what it actually does, with this one, you'd have to click into the code.
Okay.
So if you clicked into the code with the built-in one, you'd have to spell it out. But a lot, this is a more, I don't want to say advanced, but a less novice developer. So this very clearly is just like a package name suffix. It's not something that you're going to put on the Play Store. This is going to be something you deliver to somebody.
Okay.
And then receivers is very useful. So from an OSINT perspective, if you're looking for something that's an SMS stealer, a call stealer, location stealer, a lot of those are going to be associated in here. So this is, like I said, straightforward. What's it receive? What's it do? And then providers are going to be in my opinion, because I don't look at much stalkerware and stuff like that, the least interesting thing. And it's a more convoluted, complicated skills to start looking into the providers and what you care about.
Okay.
But I would say look at these three, and you'd be very surprised. Just go on Twitter, pick some random sample that Malware Hunt team or someone shares, and say like, what is this sample? And just start looking at it. Because at the end of the day, APKs are just Java. It's compiled Java with some proprietary obfuscation. That's it. It's not. This is all you need. Anything you need to do for basic Android analysis is just MobSF. You don't need 1,000 tools from some distro. You can have MobSF up in about 5 to 10 minutes. It's just an install script. And then once you throw Hunchly in, you can start taking things from here. And then just instead of having to go from a notepad or a Word file, whatever, an Excel spreadsheet is also something I see a lot of people use. Now you can just open up a new tab and you have a string selector. And you can walk away from it for a week. You get busy, whatever. But we can already see on here that all of these have selectors defined. And all we've done was look at a report, didn't do any original research. I just started looking at the samples. And this string right here is not called out in the reporting.
Right.
So if you wanted to start looking into the individual, these are, based on what I was looking at, they are big trolls. So these are probably fake names. But if you wanted to, you could start looking into, now you already have base pivots for basic OSINT, right? You have the email address. I found out today this email address does have a Twitter account associated with it, which is great. If you wanted to do that angle, usual email address stuff. And then the names, and then you could start making those base pivots for some of the other OSINT tools that everyone uses. So and then you'd actually have a reference point.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's the interesting thing, right? Is that you just like, you read this meta report and you're like, well, is this the whole story, right? And I mean, I think that's the other part that, like, being in the security community, or well, really anything, I know even for myself, like reading a news story on something that seems like really salacious or interesting, and you're kind of like, well, is this the whole story? And then you do a little bit of digging and you're like, well, why didn't they mention X, Y, or Z? But I guess the thing is that for me, generally when I would do Android reversing, is you're right, like I would have a handful of tools like JADX and JDUI, which is just their decompilers, right? They take the APK and turn it into that readable Java code. And then I would have that, and then I'd have like a proxy, I'd have, Genie motion set up, and, a whole bunch of stuff. And it was always a bit of a nightmare because it was never just a simple thing to, well, let me grab this APK. It was always like this 25-step process using a handful of different tools. And I guess the cool thing is that, like, and really the big takeaway for me is always, and I work much like you, where I'm looking for selectors, right? I'm looking to try to cut down the noise. And just by you kind of saying, okay, I'm going to take the selectors they had in the report, jam them into Hunchly, and take MobSF and actually load the samples. And very quickly, you like kind of saw there's a lot more to this story, right? And I think you're showing some more here as well.
Yeah, so this is one of the ones that they referenced in their report. So as I said, this is a MobSF screenshot right here in the Sybil blog.
Right.
So Sybil does Sybil does a pretty good job. They do a lot more Android reporting, but even if we look at this report, right, you're going to see very similar things. This is what a lot of people view as technical analysis. So if you've never done Android analysis, you're like, oh, cool, they told me the permissions. I just wanted to highlight the MobSF thing here. So everything that's in here, I didn't graph their images, but everything that's in here, they're pulling directly from right here. So if I want to know the permissions, I just click the permissions button. And so it'll tell me right out the gate which ones are dangerous, which ones are normal. And these are defined by Android within the Android developer guide. It'll tell you which permissions they can view as dangerous or should only be used if absolutely necessary, which ones are normal, and stuff like that. And it also does API analysis for you, which is really great. So this
Oh, I
one
remember
saves a
this.
lot of time. Yeah, so the biggest problem getting into Android, much like getting into reversing any other sample class, is, well, there's a bazillion API calls, and I have no idea what they do. This will give you a brief overview. So if you ever look now, after you've seen this, and you look at an Android analysis page or someone on Twitter saying, oh, it does these things, very often they're just doing this, and they're going, oh, okay, what TCP sockets are they and where are they declared? Oh, it's declared in this Java statement right here.
Right.
And then since I'm using MobSF and Hunchly, if this one happened to include the C2, I can automatically say, well, they didn't tell me in the report that it's defined in this Java statement, but now I know. And then if I see it defined another way, then I can do it that way.
Right.
That's the only problem that I've run into, is it's very difficult to do historical. So the Meta, to their credit, did say, oh yeah, by the way, there was this link. Sybil looked at this like 6 months ago or something like that, but they didn't actually list any of the samples or the associated full upload URIs and URLs. And so now we have these additional samples based on the Meta report for a group that's been clearly doing this for a while. This report came out in June. And so now I can take all of these selectors and then I make those more selectors and then I get all these samples. And then you start getting to a point where, oh, look at that, I have 45 samples and I no longer have to keep little notes and say these samples are the ones of interest, because I've already taken all of the indicators from all of these reports and just thrown them into Hunchly. I don't really have to think about it.
Right.
And same thing with translations. A lot of times I do a lot of Middle Eastern malware. I clearly do not speak the language,
Mm-hmm.
but I can do my best to say this might be related to X campaign, right? Because
Yep.
they're using a very similar language. Another thing that happens a lot is the app will be targeting someone in Korea, but we'll look at that, all the developer notes are in Chinese. That's weird. But
Right.
nothing that shows up to the end users in that language. And so you can make notes in Hunchly. I no longer have to have massive amounts of notes in random spreadsheets or whatever, and then try to compile them. Back when I used to do a lot more intelligence related work, I would run into a situation where I'm like, okay, well, we need to get this thing published. I need to get it into the thing. I've been working on this for a month. And I think this is one of the main reasons that Hunchly was created, right? A lot of people use it for basic OSINT, for journalism and stuff like that. But I think that one of the big areas that a lot of people aren't taking advantage of it is in the CTI space. People like using Analyst Notebook. That's great, but you can't capture things in Analyst Notebook outside the notes. So then you're going to have to maintain your screenshots somewhere. You're going to have to manage your DOM somewhere else, and then hope that they all meet together and that
Right.
there's no typos. But yeah, that's the main workflow I use it for. And oftentimes, what I run into, like I did last night, is I'll find a sample that isn't mentioned in either report that is using the same signing certificate and the same infrastructure components. It's actually the same CIDR that they're reaching out to from 2020 that was related to Corona applications. And then since
Ah,
then, oh yeah, they also are working with chat applications. And in this article, they were actually using a dating app to target military personnel, which is really nice of them. So
that's
you
really
can
interesting.
quickly go back in time with yeah, with starting from nothing but a blog post, and very similar to journalism. One fun thing I like to do with Hunchly is like go on whatever news page and say, okay, I wonder where that actually came from. And then you go and you have the path and you can say, well, I started at this news organization and 6 steps later, I wound up at this news organization. And it turns out they're all just repeating a mistake, which happens a lot.
Right. Right.
Um, and you can do the same thing with malware analysis. Attribution is wrong a lot,
Yes.
right? I don't think Meta is wrong in this case because the groups they were going after don't really care about hiding who they are. But sometimes they're wrong, and it would be really nice to reach out to a researcher or a developer, and instead of saying, "Oh, I think you're wrong," and then trolling them on Twitter or whatever, you could send them a package and say, "I did some analysis, and here's why." And the really cool thing from a sharing perspective is even if someone doesn't have MobSF, they have the report now,
Right.
and so the report will kind of just travel with the case instead of having to export your MobSF database, and you can view it on a regular computer, even on a corporate computer, you could view the case and not have to worry about application execution and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that was the other thing too that like I've done in the past where, and I don't often have to analyze Android apps, but even just like having Hunchly running and just like filing all the APKs away in the Hunchly case as attachments, right? And just like keeping everything bundled together because, and then, like you said, it's a pain because often you'll work on something, you'll deliver something, or you'll write a report, and whatever the other party or the client or whoever is busy and they don't get around to it, and like 2 months later they're like, hey, can you like go back in and look at XYZ, and you're like, oh boy, yep. And thankfully I've developed a little muscle memory around just jam everything into my Hunchly case, and keep that zip file exported so that I'm not hunting around for samples. Or like you said, like it's not uncommon for me to just blow away, whether it's DigitalOcean droplets or local VMs or whatever. Over time, you just tend to start doing a bit of house cleaning. And yeah, I mean, and again, the thing that really stuck out, and you did have it open briefly, but just the act of like that ability to drop a sample in, or what I learned the other day was just punching in a Google Play package name, right? And it just goes out, pulls it down, and then literally like 2 clicks, and you can see exactly where it's making its network connections. Or you had shown me as well, this sample doesn't have it, but like where is it making HTTP requests, right? Just like incredibly useful, because that, although it sounds simple, is not always a straightforward thing to do in some of the other tools. Or you end up having to hunt through like 30 different Java classes looking for that code that does that, or looking for a particular regular expression pattern that tells you, yeah, this is like communicating with an HTTP endpoint. So again, like I was just shocked at how like seamless this whole thing was. And then, yeah, I think the big thing too to me is just how you have taken the kind of selector system in Hunchly and used it in just a way that I'd never even contemplated, like function names and stuff that is really specific to hunting a particular group. How they're writing their code, and is there indicators that they're reusing chunks of code or specific pieces of it, right? So anyway, I don't actually see any questions. I think now's a good time to poke folks. If anybody has questions for either myself or David, any question at all. If you're new to Android stuff, that's totally cool. Feel free to ask anything, whether it's something you've seen here. MobSF looks like it wants to go have a nap pretty soon. Any questions at all about some of the kind of terms that have been used? This is definitely a very technical webinar compared to many of the other ones we have done. So feel free. Now is definitely the time, as we still have a bit of time left. If there's any questions, to fire them at us. And otherwise, I will let David get on with his day. I don't see anything. Phil, of course, is here to troll us. He said that all 7 Canadians really came together for assembly line. That is true. That is true. Very, very astute, Phil. Thank you for again making an appearance. Always good to see you. Does anybody else have any questions at all for David or myself before we shut this down? And in your chat window, by the way, if you look at your chat window and go to webinar, and I'll include this in the YouTube description as well. But I did put in the URL to MobSF, the donate link as well. Where if you are using MobSF or you do start using it, feel free to give a donation, as well as URL scan, which is an incredibly useful tool. Again, something David and another researcher a few years ago had pointed me to, and it's something I use all the time when investigating domains, when investigating web services, all kinds of stuff. And I will put all those in the YouTube link, so it's also in your chat window right now. Feel free to reach out to either one of us on Twitter if you have follow-up questions, or via email. And definitely, David, thank you so much for coming on here and just showing like how you move between regular research, and you didn't even do anything live actually. Like, you just pulled open your Hunchly case that you had stored, and just showed how, like, here's how I take research that's publicly available, and with a free tool able to dig into it further. I really appreciate it. I know that this is really going to be something I'm going to come back and watch again, because this is, once I started playing with it, I was totally impressed. So thank you again for coming out today, and thank you personally again for showing me a bazillion different techniques, including how to do SSL certificate pivoting, which was amazing when you did show me. And you've shown me a number of other Shodan and other tricks that really blew my mind. So thank you for not only today, but for the many years of teaching me all the new stuff.
Yeah, for sure, man. I hope it was helpful.
Totally, absolutely. All right, cool. Oh, and now do we have? We actually have some questions real quick, so I'm not going to let you go yet. Uh,
Okay.
David, do you just use Google Translate for foreign languages, or do you have other go-to resources?
I mainly use Google Translate and Yandex Translate,
Gotcha.
depending on the language. The main reason I use Google Translate for a lot of stuff, as opposed to like Bing, and there are some other more paid services that are a little bit better. So if you are doing this in a paid way, I would look at some paid services. But Google has now started to move into verified translations for things, versus just where they actually will have someone that speaks the language verify that the translation's correct. And it's been really beneficial for me because, like I said, I do a lot of stuff for some languages that don't work so well with automatic translation.
Yep.
And sometimes it's still not the best, to be honest, but it at least gives me some inkling of what's going on outside of the code, because a lot of the more targeted campaigns, if you don't know the language or the context of why they might be doing that targeting, it's a lot more difficult to get better understanding of the campaign.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it's amazing because sometimes, yeah, Google Translate is awesome, and actually recently I used it to assist somebody on a thing they were working on, and it actually kind of like really broke a case open because it completely translated this name perfectly. And I was actually kind of shocked because it's not often that that happens. And that actually kind of helped them close this case. But it is a tricky thing. And we actually have another question for you. I'm going to try to summarize this as best as possible, but they're kind of saying, so for URL scan for correlation, does it give hits on icons and image hashes as well? Much like you can run hash searches on Shodan or other places. Does URL scan do that?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
And fave icon hashes and icon hashes are very tricky because everyone has their different method of calculating the hash. So,
Oh,
for example, John doesn't just do a straight hash. So, if you're doing a fave icon hash pivot on Shodan, it's not as simple as just getting the blob and hashing it. I forget what he uses, but he actually uses a Python library and encodes it prior to hashing. So
uh,
icon hashing is useful. One thing I didn't show is that MobSF does hash the icons of all the packages, which is also a very good pivot because even if they change the name of the application, a lot of times the app will be the same. But I don't think URL scan does that. They're constantly developing. They're backed by two pretty sizable organizations now.
okay.
So they have been developing a lot of really interesting things. I don't believe that they do that yet.
Okay.
But if you did, if even if they do, you probably would not be able to use that in Shodan or like Binary Edge or something like that, just because no one seems to agree on what the best way to hash something is. So I've
Hmm.
run into that a lot where I'll find something interesting and I have the hash of it locally and then no one else has it. And that's how I figured out that Shodan has their own method of calculating the hash. So,
Okay.
uh,
Got
so
you.
yeah, even if they do it, yeah, it's very similar to a lot of the other hashes, like security text hashes and stuff like that. Everyone calculates them differently just because they want to keep you inside their platform. That's my opinion, obviously, but
I
that's
got you.
that's my theory.
Got you, got you. Yeah, and for those of you that were kind of listening, the favicon or favicon, I don't even know how you pronounce that, is the, in a Chrome tab, it's that little kind of icon that you'll see that a website kind of hosts that gives you that nice little icon for your tab or in your browser view, and they can actually be pivoted on. You can kind of hunt around in Shodan and other places to see if that particular icon is used in different domains, much like we would use analytics codes or other things. You can actually use the same. And I too couldn't remember and I don't recall seeing hashes, image hashes, but URL scan is worth
This
playing
was
around with.
yeah. I have one up on the screen pretty recently. I did this one yesterday. Um, so it doesn't look like it does it yet. They've added a lot of stuff that they
Hmm.
didn't have before, but I don't believe they have the image hash, and I think it might be related to what I just described. Is they allow you to pivot on a lot of other indicators. If they do it, the one place it would be in the indicators tab. This isn't a live page, so I can't click through on it. But if you scan a page, they do have a bunch of hash indicators in here. So it might be in there because I know they hash the content. I'm just not, I don't want to say they do,
Yeah.
but that's where it would be if they did it.
Yeah, I don't see any. I just pulled it open myself. I don't see anything in the indicator tabs. But there, yeah, it is worth like just running a domain of interest in there, or running a scan against something, and like just looking at how they all the information they pull out. They'll tell you like what all of the various HTTP requests would be. So when the page loads, if you think about the network tab in your Google Chrome developer tools, like they'll give you a kind of printout of every single place that that web page reaches out to load resources, load JavaScript, all of that stuff. So whether you're like looking at ad fraud or whether you're looking at malware stuff or just trying to find what is this web page actually doing, URL scan is just like it is incredible. And and yeah, and it does have an image tab in the it does have an image tab inside of the results. Um, and it'll allow you to search based on the image file name. So you can pivot off of that in URL scan, but again, file names can be the same across tons of different domains, so it's not always a great way to do that. All right, cool. All right, we will cut it there. We're right at the top of the hour. Again, I don't see any more questions coming in. Um, Thanks again, David. I'm sure we'll be chatting again very soon. I'm going to end it here. Thank you to everybody for showing up today. Really appreciate it. Next week, I'm going to be doing just a regular old Hunchly desktop training session. So keep an eye out in your email for that, as I'll just be walking through all the glorious Hunchly things like normal. And David, I hope we get you back on again. In the near future, maybe you can show us some other interesting stuff, maybe some assembly line, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and put you on the spot. And thanks again, everybody. Take care and bye bye.